My daughter's art teacher asked, "Why is your child drawing maps of a city the government demolished and erased from all records?" Mr. Gaines stood at his classroom door holding a portfolio of my daughter's artwork, his hands trembling slightly. The hallway smelled of paint and cleaning solution, and other parents were streaming past us toward their own conferences. I'd expected to discuss Lily's progress with watercolors or her tendency to work alone during group projects. Instead, he pulled out a detailed ink drawing that made my breath catch. It showed a street grid with labeled buildings, parks, and intersections rendered in precise architectural detail. The legend in the corner read, Ashmont District, 1,994 inches in my 8-year-old daughter's careful handwriting. Mr. Gaines asked if I recognized the location. I told him I'd never seen it before. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Chen, I have a master's degree in urban geography. I spent 2 years researching erased American cities for my thesis. Ashmont was a thriving neighborhood of 30,000 people in Pennsylvania that was demolished in 1996 under eminent domain. Every building was razed. Every resident was forcibly relocated. All municipal records were sealed or destroyed. The official story claims Ashmont never existed as a distinct municipality, that it was just an unincorporated area that was legally absorbed. But I found evidence in archived newspapers and satellite imagery that proved otherwise. This drawing your daughter made matches the actual street layout exactly, down to businesses and landmarks that were never digitized or recorded publicly." I stared at the drawing, trying to make sense of what he was telling me. Lily was 8 years old. She'd never been to Pennsylvania. She spent her time playing with dolls and watching cartoons, not studying urban planning or historical maps. I asked how he could be certain it was accurate. Mr. Gaines pulled out his phone and showed me a grainy satellite image from 1995 that he'd obtained through his research. The street patterns matched Lily's drawing perfectly. He'd compared them side by side. The angles, the spacing, even the small details were identical. He'd asked Lily where she'd learned about Ashmont, and she'd looked confused, saying she didn't know what he was talking about. She'd just been drawing what was in her head. Mr. Gaines said this wasn't the only one. Over the past month, Lily had produced 15 different maps of Ashmont, each showing a different section of the district. Together, they formed a complete cartographic record of a place that had been systematically erased. He'd kept them in his classroom, not showing them to anyone else yet, because he wanted to talk to me first. His expression was worried when he said that if the wrong people discovered what Lily was drawing, there could be serious consequences. I asked what he meant by consequences. Mr. Gaines glanced down the hallway before answering. The demolition of Ashmont was legally questionable at best. The eminent domain seizure was fast-tracked through courts in ways that violated residents' rights. There were allegations of corporate collusion, of payoffs to local officials, of environmental contamination that was covered up rather than remediated. A major development corporation wanted the land for a distribution center that would generate massive profits. They partnered with state officials to classify the area as blighted, even though it was a stable working-class community. Residents who protested were threatened or arrested. A few activists tried to fight it and disappeared, literally disappeared. The woman who led the resistance was named Grace Holloway. She organized documentation efforts, filmed the demolitions, gathered evidence of the corruption. Then one day she was gone. Her family said she'd moved away voluntarily. Others said she'd been silenced permanently. Either way, the documentation she'd gathered vanished with her. The corporate interests won. Ashmont was erased, and everyone involved made sure it stayed erased. My hands felt cold holding Lily's drawings. I asked if he thought my daughter was in danger because of these maps. Mr. Gaines said he didn't know, but he believed I should be careful about who saw them. If anyone connected to the original demolition discovered that someone was reconstructing detailed maps of Ashmont, they might take action to protect their interests. I told him this was insane, that my daughter was just a child making drawings, that surely nobody would care about maps of a place that hadn't existed in over 25 years. His expression told me he disagreed. He carefully placed the drawings back in the portfolio and handed it to me. "Mrs. Chen, I'm giving these to you because I think they're important. Someone taught your daughter about Ashmont, whether she consciously remembers it or not. You need to figure out who and why. And until you do, I'd suggest keeping these somewhere safe and not showing them to anyone." I left the school in a daze, the portfolio tucked under my arm, my mind racing through impossible explanations. My husband Gregory was traveling for work, not due back until Friday. Lily was at home with her grandmother, my mother Anna, who watched her after school while I worked my nursing shifts. I drove home on autopilot, barely noticing traffic. My mother was in the kitchen making dinner when I arrived. Lily was at the table doing homework, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail, her tongue sticking out slightly as she concentrated on math problems. She looked up and smiled when I walked in. "Mom, can I have a snack? Grandma says I have to finish my homework first." I told her to finish her work and then we'd have snacks together. My mother asked how the conference went. I said we needed to talk privately and gestured toward the living room. She followed me, her expression curious. I spread Lily's drawings across the coffee table. My mother's face went white. She actually stumbled backward and sat down hard on the couch. Her hand went to her mouth and she made a sound between a gasp and a sob. I asked if she recognized the drawings. She couldn't speak for several seconds. When she finally found her voice, it was shaking. "Where did Lily get these? Who showed her these?" I said Mr. Gaines believed Lily was drawing from memory, reconstructing maps of a demolished city called Ashmont. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Grace Holloway, she whispered. Oh God, Grace. I sat down next to her, my heart pounding. I asked who Grace Holloway was. My mother wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She was my sister, your aunt. She died in 1996. I felt the room tilt. I'd never known my mother had a sister. She'd never mentioned any siblings. I'd grown up believing she was an only child. My mother took a shaky breath and explained. Grace had been 3 years younger than her, passionate and idealistic. When the state announced plans to demolish Ashmont where they both lived, Grace had organized the resistance while my mother had taken the buyout offer and moved away. My mother had been pregnant with me at the time, scared of losing everything, and willing to accept the compensation the government offered. But Grace had refused. She'd fought the demolition, documented everything, and gathered evidence of the corruption and collusion behind the seizure. She'd become the face of the resistance, giving interviews and organizing protests. My mother had begged her to take the money and leave, but Grace wouldn't abandon the community. Then Grace disappeared. The official story was she'd accepted a settlement and relocated out of state, but my mother never heard from her again. No calls, no letters, no contact. She'd searched for years, filed missing persons reports that went nowhere, hired private investigators who found nothing. Eventually, she'd accepted that Grace was dead, that she'd been silenced for being too effective a threat to powerful interests. I asked why she'd never told me about any of this. My mother's face crumpled. Because I was ashamed. I abandoned my sister when she needed me most. I took their money and walked away while Grace stayed to fight. And when she disappeared, I knew it was my fault for not standing with her. I couldn't talk about it without admitting my cowardice, so I just tried to forget. I changed my last name when I married your father. I never went back to Pennsylvania. I buried that whole part of my life and tried to pretend it never happened. She looked at Lily's drawings spread across the table. Grace had maps. She'd drawn detailed cartographic surveys of Ashmont to document what was being destroyed. She'd planned to use them as evidence in legal challenges. When she disappeared, those maps disappeared too. I thought they were gone forever. But somehow Lily has recreated them exactly. These drawings are identical to Grace's work. How is that possible? I had no answer. I asked where my mother had lived after leaving Ashmont. She said she'd moved to Maryland where she'd met my father. I'd been born in Maryland and raised there until we moved to Virginia when I was 5. Lily had been born in Virginia 8 years ago. There was no direct connection to Pennsylvania or Ashmont in my daughter's life. No way she could have seen Grace's maps or learned about the demolished city. My mother stood up suddenly and went to the basement. I heard her moving things around, the sound of boxes being opened. She returned 10 minutes later carrying a small metal lockbox. Her hands shook as she opened it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck, something I'd seen my whole life but never questioned. Inside were photographs, documents, and a folded piece of paper that she handled with reverence. She unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map of Ashmont's Central District. The style was identical to Lily's drawings. The same precise architectural detail, the same careful labeling. This is the only thing I kept from Grace's apartment after she disappeared. I was too scared to keep anything else, afraid it would make me a target too. But I couldn't destroy this completely, so I hid it and tried to forget about it. She laid Grace's map next to Lily's drawings. They matched perfectly. Same streets, same buildings, same artistic style, as if the same hand had drawn them decades apart. I asked if Lily had ever seen this map. My mother swore she hadn't. The lockbox had been sealed since before Lily was born. She'd never opened it in front of my daughter, never even mentioned its existence. Yet somehow Lily was reproducing Grace's work with perfect accuracy. But Lily appeared in the doorway, finished with her homework and wanting her promised snack. She saw us staring at the drawings and asked what we were looking at. I knelt down to her eye level and asked gently where she'd learned to draw these maps. She tilted her head, thinking, I don't know. They're just in my head. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see streets and buildings and I just draw what I see. I asked if anyone had showed her pictures or told her about these places. She shook her head. No, they're just there, like memories, but not mine. Her words sent chills down my spine. My mother made a small sound and left the room quickly. I heard her crying in the kitchen. I gave Lily her snack and sent her to play in her room, then went to find my mother. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. It's not possible, she kept saying. Genetic memory isn't real. She can't have inherited Grace's knowledge. That's not how human biology works. But I'd heard of cases, rare instances of trauma or intense experience affecting genetic expression in ways that manifested in subsequent generations. Epigenetics. The science was still emerging, still controversial. Could Grace's obsessive documentation of Ashmont, her passionate commitment to preserving its memory, have somehow been encoded in a way that passed through my mother to me to Lily? It sounded absurd, but I had no other explanation. That night after Lily was asleep, I searched online for information about Ashmont. There was almost nothing. A few archived newspaper articles about development projects in Pennsylvania in the mid-1990s that mentioned eminent domain seizures but never used the name Ashmont. Satellite imagery from 1995 showed a dense residential neighborhood, but imagery from 1997 showed empty raised land. In between, the place had ceased to exist. I found one academic paper by a researcher named Dr. Marcus Vila, who'd studied forced urban displacement. He'd included Ashmont as a case study, describing it as one of the most comprehensive erasures of a community in modern American history. According to his research, the displacement had been achieved through a combination of legal manipulation, police intimidation, and corporate pressure. Residents who resisted were arrested on fabricated charges. Those who spoke to media found themselves facing sudden tax audits or code enforcement actions. The few who managed to file lawsuits were tied up in courts until their resources ran out. The demolition proceeded on an accelerated schedule, with buildings torn down even while some legal challenges were still pending. Dr. Vila's paper included a note that his research had been limited because most primary sources had been destroyed or sealed. He mentioned Grace Holloway by name as the only activist who'd attempted comprehensive documentation, and noted that she'd disappeared before her evidence could be submitted to courts. I found Dr. Vila's faculty page at a university in California. He was still teaching, specializing in urban justice and displacement studies. I sent him an email that night explaining that my daughter was somehow drawing detailed maps of Ashmont and asking if he could help me understand what had happened there. I didn't expect a quick response, but my phone rang at 6 a.m. the next morning. Dr. Vela's voice was urgent. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to be very careful. If your daughter is producing maps of Ashmont, there are people who will consider that a threat. The corporation that developed the land, Meridian Holdings, has connections to state and federal officials. They've sued researchers and journalists who've tried to investigate the demolition. They've successfully suppressed most documentation through legal threats and intimidation. If they learn your daughter has reconstructed cartographic evidence of what they destroyed, they'll move to contain it." I felt fear replace my confusion. I asked what he meant by contain. Dr. Vila said, "They'll try to discredit the maps, claim they're fabricated or inaccurate. They'll investigate your family, looking for anything they can use to undermine credibility. If that doesn't work, they'll escalate. I've seen them destroy careers, ruin reputations, even pursue criminal charges on trumped-up pretexts. And in Grace Holloway's case, they may have done worse." I asked if he believed Grace had been killed. Dr. Vila was quiet for a moment. "I've never been able to prove it, but yes, I believe she was silenced permanently. Too many people I've interviewed mentioned threats made against her in the weeks before she disappeared. Too many coincidences around the timing. She was scheduled to testify in a federal hearing about the displacement the week after she vanished. Her documentation would have exposed criminal collusion between Meridian Holdings and state officials. That testimony never happened. The hearing was postponed and then quietly canceled. The investigation died, and Ashmont was erased from history." He asked if I'd be willing to meet with him and bring Lily's drawings. He wanted to see them, to verify their accuracy, and to discuss how to protect them and my family. I agreed to meet him the following week when Gregory would be home and could come with me. Dr. Vila said he'd make arrangements and warned me again to be careful about who I told, who I showed the drawings to, and what digital trails I left. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me. "Your daughter may have access to the only complete record of Ashmont that still exists. That makes her both extremely valuable and extremely dangerous to the wrong people." Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of everything around me. I noticed a gray sedan parked on our street that hadn't been there before. I saw the same man in a blue jacket at the grocery store, and then again at the gas station. My work email received several phishing attempts. My mother's landline started getting hang-up calls. Gregory came home on Friday and I told him everything. He listened with growing alarm, examined Lily's drawings, read my mother's lockbox documents. His first instinct was to destroy the drawings and forget the whole thing. I understood his fear, but I also felt a pull towards something larger. Grace had died trying to preserve the truth about Ashmont. If Lily had somehow inherited her knowledge, that felt like a responsibility, not just a danger. Gregory argued that our daughter's safety mattered more than historical justice for a demolished city. I agreed, but I also believed that running from this wouldn't protect us. If Meridian Holdings or their associates wanted to silence us, destroying the evidence wouldn't stop them. We needed to get ahead of the threat, to make the information public so that eliminating us became pointless. We drove to California the following week to meet Dr. Vela. He taught at a university in San Diego and met us in his office, a small cluttered space filled with books and maps and research papers. Lily had brought her portfolio of drawings, and Dr. Vila examined each one with intense focus. He pulled out his own research files, comparing Lily's maps to the few surviving fragments of evidence he'd collected over years. Street names matched, building locations matched, even details about businesses and landmarks that had never been officially recorded were accurate. He verified them against testimony from former Ashmont residents he'd interviewed. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "Your daughter has recreated a comprehensive cartographic record of Ashmont. With these maps and my archived interviews with survivors, we could rebuild a historical picture of the community that was destroyed. This is exactly what Grace Holloway died trying to preserve." I asked how we could use this information safely. Dr. Vila said we needed to make it public in a way that provided protection through exposure. He knew journalists who specialized in corporate corruption stories. He had contacts at human rights organizations that documented forced displacement. If we could release the maps along with testimony from Ashmont survivors and documentation of Meridian Holdings' illegal actions, the story would be too big to suppress. Gregory wasn't convinced. He asked what would stop Meridian Holdings from retaliating against us even after the story went public. Dr. Vila admitted there were risks, but said publicity was our best protection. Once the information is out there, silencing you serves no purpose. The damage is already done. Right now you're vulnerable because the knowledge exists only in private. Make it public and you remove the incentive for violence. He'd already started reaching out to former Ashmont residents, people he'd interviewed for his research who might be willing to tell their stories publicly. Many had moved on, built new lives, and wanted to forget the trauma. But some had never stopped being angry about what had been done to them. Those people might be willing to stand with us. Over the next month, Dr. Vila coordinated with a network of displaced Ashmont residents. We spoke with them through secure video calls. They described the community that had been destroyed, a working-class neighborhood with deep roots and strong social bonds. They talked about the intimidation they'd faced, the legal manipulations, the forced relocations. Several had lost everything when they were displaced, unable to afford housing in the area where the buyouts placed them. Some had been arrested on false charges when they protested. One man named Dennis Kowalski described watching his childhood home demolished while police held him back at gunpoint. A woman named Ruth Alvarez talked about her mother dying from stress-related heart failure weeks after being forced from her home. Another man, Thomas Bailey, described threats made against his children when he tried to file a lawsuit. The stories painted a picture of systematic abuse of power, of corporate interests wielding government authority to destroy a community for profit. The distribution center Meridian Holdings built on Ashmont's land had generated billions in revenue over the past 25 years. That profit had been built on the suffering of 30,000 displaced people. Lily sat in on some of these conversations, quietly drawing while the adults talked. Afterward, she'd show me new maps, each one adding detail to the picture of Ashmont that was emerging. She'd started drawing not just streets but individual houses, labeling them with family names she couldn't possibly know, but that the survivors confirmed were accurate. The Kowalskis lived on Maple Street, third house from the corner, she'd say, showing me a drawing. Dennis Kowalski would stare at her sketch and confirm yes, that was exactly right. That was his family's house down to the porch swing and the oak tree in the yard. It was impossible, and yet it kept happening. Dr. Vila worked with a journalist named Angela Wu, who wrote for a national investigative publication. She'd covered corporate corruption cases before and was interested in the Ashmont story. Over several weeks, she interviewed displaced residents, reviewed Lily's maps, examined the documents my mother had kept from Grace's work, and investigated Meridian Holdings' current operations. She discovered the company had used similar tactics in 3 other locations over the past 30 years, each time seizing land through questionable eminent domain claims, each time displacing communities and erasing records. Ashmont wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Angela's article was scheduled to publish on a Monday morning in October. The weekend before publication, things escalated. A man knocked on our door Saturday afternoon claiming to be from the county assessor's office, saying he needed to inspect our home for tax purposes. Gregory told him to make an appointment and closed the door. An hour later, 2 different men in suits appeared, identifying themselves as representatives from Meridian Holdings' legal department. They said they'd heard rumors we were planning to make false claims about their company and wanted to offer us a settlement to avoid litigation. Gregory told them to leave our property or he'd call the police. That night, our home security system detected someone trying to access our garage. Police responded but found no one. Sunday morning, I discovered our car tires had been slashed. Gregory called Dr. Vila and Angela Wu to tell them what was happening. Angela moved up the publication schedule. The article went live Sunday evening instead of Monday morning. The headline read, "The City That Disappeared, How Corporate Power Erased a Pennsylvania Community." The piece included Lily's maps, testimonies from survivors, documentation of Meridian Holdings' illegal tactics, and evidence of their pattern of similar displacements. Within hours, it was being shared across social media. Other journalists picked up the story. Legal advocacy groups announced investigations. Former Ashmont residents started coming forward with their own stories, people who'd been too scared to speak publicly before, but now felt empowered by the exposure. The Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania announced they were reviewing the original eminent domain proceedings. Federal officials said they'd investigate whether civil rights violations had occurred. Meridian Holdings issued a statement denying all allegations and threatening to sue for defamation. Their legal team sent cease and desist letters to Angela Wu, Dr. Vela, and us. But the story had momentum now. More evidence kept surfacing. Former employees of Meridian Holdings came forward describing the intimidation tactics they'd been ordered to use against Ashmont residents. A retired state official admitted he'd taken bribes to fast-track the eminent domain process. Documents emerged showing Meridian Holdings had known about toxic contamination on the Ashmont site and had demolished the buildings to bury the evidence rather than pay for remediation. The scandal grew beyond just the displacement of one community to encompass bribery, environmental crimes, and systemic corruption. Criminal investigations were opened. Civil lawsuits were filed by former residents seeking compensation. Meridian Holdings' stock price collapsed. Their CEO resigned under pressure. By the end of the month, 3 executives had been arrested on fraud and bribery charges. Throughout all of this, Lily kept drawing. She produced maps of Ashmont showing the community at different time periods, going back decades before the demolition. She drew the neighborhood as it had existed in the 1980s, the 1970s, even earlier. Former residents would see her drawings and break down crying, recognizing their childhoods captured in ink, places they thought they'd never see again. One elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, no relation, looked at Lily's drawing of a corner store and sobbed. "That's exactly how it looked. I worked there when I was a teenager. I haven't thought about that place in 30 years, but this is perfect. How does she know?" I had no answer. The mechanics of how Lily had inherited Grace's knowledge remained mysterious. Geneticists we consulted said epigenetic memory transfer was theoretically possible, but had never been documented at this scale. Psychologists suggested cryptomnesia, hidden memories Lily might have absorbed from conversations or materials she'd encountered. But none of the explanations fully accounted for the precise detail and accuracy of her drawings. In the end, we stopped trying to understand and simply accepted it as reality. Lily had become a living archive of a demolished city, a human repository of memory that powerful interests had tried to erase. The legal consequences for Meridian Holdings took years to unfold fully. Criminal trials resulted in convictions for bribery, fraud, and environmental violations. Civil lawsuits led to a settlement fund that provided compensation to displaced Ashmont residents and their families. The state of Pennsylvania formally apologized for its role in the illegal displacement and established a memorial commission to preserve Ashmont's history. Lily's maps became the foundation for a digital archive, a comprehensive record of the community that had been destroyed. Former residents contributed photographs, documents, and oral histories. The archive grew to include everything from street layouts to individual family stories, creating a complete picture of what had been lost. Schools in Pennsylvania began teaching about Ashmont as a cautionary tale about corporate power and government accountability. Lily gave presentations at several universities, describing her experience and showing her maps. She was 10 years old by then, more aware of what her drawings meant and the responsibility they carried. My mother reconnected with other former Ashmont residents through the advocacy networks that formed around the scandal. She met people who'd known Grace, who remembered her passion and courage. They shared stories that helped my mother process her grief and guilt. One woman told her that Grace had understood why my mother left, that she'd never blamed her for choosing safety over resistance. Grace knew not everyone could fight. She was grateful that you got yourself and your baby somewhere safe. She wouldn't have wanted you to sacrifice your family. Those words helped my mother begin to forgive herself. She became involved in housing justice advocacy, working with communities facing displacement, and helping them document their histories before erasure. She said it was what Grace would have wanted, turning grief into action. The man who'd led Meridian Holdings' Ashmont operation, a vice president named Jonathan Reeves, was convicted of bribery and racketeering. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence that he'd ordered Grace Holloway's disappearance. A former security contractor testified that he'd been paid to abduct Grace and make it look like she'd left voluntarily. Her body was never found, but phone records and witness testimony established that Reeves had orchestrated her elimination. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The revelation that Grace had been murdered rather than disappeared brought closure, but also renewed grief. My mother had known in her heart, but hearing it confirmed was devastating. The Ashmont survivors held a memorial service for Grace on what would have been her 60th birthday. We planted a tree in a park that had been built near the site of the old neighborhood, a living memorial to the woman who'd given her life trying to preserve her community's history. Lily spoke at the service, reading from Grace's journals that had been recovered during the investigations. Grace's words about community, resistance, and the importance of memory resonated with the hundreds of former residents who attended. Afterward, an elderly man approached us. He introduced himself as Michael Holloway, Grace's former neighbor. He told Lily that she looked exactly like Grace had at that age, the same intensity in her eyes, the same determination. He said Grace would have been proud that her work had continued through unexpected means, that the memory she'd died protecting had found a way to survive through her grandniece. Lily asked him what Grace had been trying to accomplish. Michael said, "She wanted people to remember that Ashmont existed, that we existed. Power can demolish buildings and redistribute people, but it can't erase the truth if enough people refuse to forget. Grace believed that. Now because of you, everyone knows she was right." 5 years after Angela W.'s article published, Pennsylvania established the Ashmont Heritage District on a section of the former neighborhood. The distribution center had been partially demolished after Meridian Holdings went bankrupt in the wake of the scandal. The state purchased the land and converted it to a memorial park and educational center. Lily's maps were displayed in the Heritage Center, alongside photographs, artifacts, and testimonies from survivors. School groups toured the center to learn about displacement, corporate power, and the importance of documenting history. Lily was 13 by then, focused on her art and interested in architecture. She'd stopped drawing Ashmont maps, having completed what felt like a comprehensive record. But she'd started a new project, documenting other at-risk communities, places facing displacement or erasure. She traveled with Dr. Vila and my mother to neighborhoods threatened by development, teaching residents how to map and document their own histories before it was too late. Her work inspired a national movement of community cartography, ordinary people creating records of their neighborhoods as protection against erasure. I thought often about Grace, about the aunt I'd never known whose passion had somehow passed through generations to manifest in my daughter. I thought about the price she'd paid for refusing to forget, for believing that truth and memory mattered more than safety or profit. I wondered if she'd ever imagined that her work would survive like this, encoded in DNA or consciousness or whatever mysterious mechanism had transferred her knowledge to Lily. The story became part of our family's identity. We were the keepers of Ashmont's memory, the people who'd refused to let power erase history. Lily understood the weight of that role. She knew that her drawings had achieved what Grace had died trying to accomplish, that justice delayed was still justice, that the truth had a resilience that outlasted attempts to destroy it. 3 decades after Ashmont was demolished, the city lived again in maps and memories and the testimony of survivors. The government and corporations had tried to erase it, but they'd failed. Because Grace had fought, because Lily had remembered, because enough people had refused to forget, Ashmont's story survived. And in surviving, it became a warning and a weapon against those who believed power could rewrite history by destroying evidence. They'd learned it couldn't. Memory found a way. Truth found a way. Justice found a way. And a little girl's drawings had made it possible. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.